There's a saying in cricket, you must not lose hope till the very last ball is bowled. This is very much true about life also. A hero who fights against insurmountable odds with tenacity, with resilience, will often be presented with lucky opportunities. If he can seize it, then the match can be turned around. Exactly this happened on 19th of October 1781. The formidable British Army, under the command of their seasoned military general, Lord Cornwallis, came out and surrendered. They surrendered before a ragtag American militia led by George Washington. Until this point in the war, the Britishers had been able to dominate the Americans. But at Yorktown, George Washington turned this course of the war and altered the flow of history. Yes, we are talking about the same Lord Cornwallis who would later come to India as Governor General of Bengal. A very seasoned military commander. He had won several battles for the British. Under his command, the British had been able to dominate the entire southern part of the American colonies. Major North American ports were also under his control, and he took position at Yorktown, which was strategically located between north and south. So he could send troops south and north depending on the need. He was also connected with the British Navy in the Atlantic. Thinking that he is in a very good position, he became complacent. George Washington exploited this complacency. With the help of French troops, he was able to disconnect his army with the rest of the British troops spread across the 13 colonies. The British Navy was defeated by the French Navy in the Atlantic, and Cornwallis lost touch with his navy too. In a matter of few days, he lost nerve and he decided to surrender before George Washington. This would mark the end of the American War of Independence. Some desultory fighting did continue, but finally in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed and Britain told to its 13 colonies, "Ja Simran, ji le apni zindagi." This is a very historic event, guys, not just for America, but for the whole world. We'll take this opportunity today to dive in deeper and try to understand the American Revolution. Mahatma Gandhi had very well said this. He mentioned, or he said, "A small body of determined spirits, fired by an unquenchable faith in their mission, can alter the course of history." This is precisely what is the story of the American Revolution. When the 13 colonies will take on the might of Britain from 1775 till 1783 and create a new nation state of United States of America. This nation state wasn't just any other country that was born. It was a nation state that was born on a new set of ideas, an alternate vision for the world. And this alternate vision is captured in the Declaration of Independence that the founding fathers of America drafted. The spirit of this Declaration of Independence is perhaps best captured in this quote. This declaration, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, says, "All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness." The world that we inhabit today, guys, is based on the ideas of liberty and individual freedom. It wasn't the case always. The medieval world was dominated by traditional authorities, maybe the church, the monarch. It was based on absolute submission to such authorities. The dogmatic control of these authorities was complete and absolute. Individuals' rights and freedoms were virtually non-existent. In that darkness, the American Revolution, it sparkles as a bright beacon. It gives a new vision for the world to strive for. Since then, till date, United States of America has played a very crucial role in the history of the world. And therefore, it is important for us, imperative for us to understand this seminal development called as American Revolution. So what is American Revolution? American Revolution, guys, is the fight by the 13 colonies of Britain in North America against its metropole, that is Britain, from 1775 to 1783. A fight in which these colonies will finally create a new nation state called as United States of America. A nation state that was founded not on the old, but on new ideas. Ideas that had emerged during the course of enlightenment. An alternate vision of the world, a world that was based on individuals' rights and freedoms, was the core essence of these thoughts. And United States of America gave practical shape to all of this. They created or drafted a new modern constitution, which has ever since influenced the political history of the world. According to a research, after the American Constitution was drafted, there have been more than 7,000 constitutions drafted in the world, and none can say that it was not influenced by the American Constitution. In some way or the other, the American Constitution has influenced the subsequent ones, and therefore the trends of world's politics have been shaped by USA. But why did this revolution take place in USA? When did people go and colonize those areas? Who were the people who lived there? What was their life? We have to first understand these fundamental questions to then see how the revolution will be such a significant one. The story of USA actually does not start in America. It starts in Europe itself. In 1453, a very crucial development takes place in eastern part of Europe. Constantinople, the capital of the crumbling Eastern Roman Empire, the once formidable and impregnable city, finally fell to the assault of the rising Ottoman Turk power in its vicinity. The Ottoman Turks, who had harbored this dream of winning this crown prize, finally do that in 1453, and they are able to have a kingdom that straddles Europe and Asia. They are now in a position to dominate the trade that was going along on the ancient Silk Route. Consequently, for Europe, this trade that connected Asia with Europe overland became expensive and also risky. This fired a desire amongst Europeans to find out alternate safe sea routes to India in particular and Asia in general. Portugal, and then followed by Portugal, Spain, took lead in this process. This was a time of Renaissance and many scientific discoveries and innovations. Europe was coming out of the Dark Ages. It was now trusting rationalism, scientific observations, and was leaving behind the time of dogmas and superstitions. Consequently, many Europeans, they start out in the quest to find out that alternate safe sea route. Into the Atlantic they go. Little did they know that on the other side of Atlantic are two massive continents. Many explorers carrying their national flags will venture deep into the Atlantic and accidentally discover new lands. Columbus of Spain, John Cabot of England, Amerigo Vespucci of Italy, Jacques Cartier of France, all of these are names that are hallowed in history. These men took bold risks for their nations and for humanity, and in due course they were able to discover these far distant lands. Europe will realize that there are virgin lands on the other side of Atlantic which humanity did not ever know of. These lands will be called as the New World, based on the book that Amerigo Vespucci would write later after going back to Europe by the same title, The New World. These areas will be referred to as that is the New World. This New World presented the Europeans with opportunities to colonize this land. Land was huge, sprawling. The population over there of native tribes was relatively very sparse. And therefore, it was essential to colonize these areas by taking white settler Europeans to these new lands. Britain did that on the eastern coast of North America. It took many British people and of course some others also and colonized the eastern coast of today's United States of America. Who were these people who went there and what were their motivations? The people who went there to these colonies were people who came from very different backgrounds and consequently had many different types of motivations. The first wave was generally of those who were persecuted for their religious beliefs. Europe back then was a society which was very intolerant. There was intense persecution of rival Christian sects. Catholics and Protestants were at each other's throats. Europe would see the infamous 30 Years' War where they were ripping apart each other's gut for 30 long years. People wanted the freedom of religion to worship God as they understood was the right way. So many of these people who were persecuted for their religious beliefs, they got attracted to the new land where they would have the freedom to do their worship the way they wanted to. The convicts were also motivated to go to these new lands as the government had promised them freedom there. Given the choice of either staying here in prison or starting life afresh on the other side of the Atlantic, the convicts definitely felt that it was a much lucrative offer to go there. Along with them came the traders and adventurers. Adventurers came because they were looking for, obviously, the adventure. The area of America provided them with ample opportunities of adventure. There were wild tribes, there was huge land, there was a lot of things to do over there, and consequently, we'll see many adventurers will come and so will traders. Traders were naturally seeking opportunities for trade in this distant area, buying stuff from the colonies, the natural resources, and selling them in Europe, and buying products of Europe, the finished goods, and selling them in colonies was a very attractive trading opportunity. The landless laborers and peasants who had been, given a raw deal because of the enclosure movement in Britain, they now did not have access to the land, and therefore they felt that virgin soil of North America was their calling. The government was ready to give access to fertile soil over here for anybody who was willing to take the risk. And therefore, many landless laborers and peasants went from Europe to Americas. The nationalities who came over here were not just English. English were, of course, the foremost, the most important section, but Scots, Germans, Dutch, French, many others came and resided in the British colonies. Consequently, we see that these 13 colonies that will spring up under the Britishers in North America, they developed a culture that was very liberal and cosmopolitan, because it wasn't a uniform, homogeneous kind of a society. It was a society of many different type of people. And since this land of North America had many challenges, it also led to a individualistic and independent kind of a streak. These are the values that we can associate with the American society even today. Liberal, cosmopolitan, and yet individualistic and independent. These are the characteristics that you can find in American culture to this date. Ultimately, over the generations, the society over here developed on different lines as compared to Britain. But a few things always kept them connected. The 13 colonies required the protection of the British Army. They followed the same religion of Christianity, and they spoke the same language, that is English. And consequently, they were under that same Anglo-Saxon, sphere. And that is how the umbilical cord will keep them connected with their motherland. This is how things look like, guys. Here in USA, you have the Appalachian Mountains. From the mountains to the coast, on this side were the 13 colonies. They had not yet ventured to the west. It was only on the eastern coast that these colonies were spread. These colonies, starting from north, were 13 in all. These could be classified as New England colonies of the north, New England, because these were the colonies established the earliest. That's why that name of New England. New England colonies, middle colonies over here, and the southern colonies, total 13 colonies in all, were created in this process, all on the eastern coast of United States of America of today. The relations of these colonies with England have to be understood to understand why they will rebel against Britain. To start with, the relations of the colonies were exceptionally good with Britain. The colonies were having a friendly and loyal kind of an attitude. Britain was happy with the colonies because it was a source of raw material for them, a market for the finished products of Britain, and the colonies were happy because they were part of the most formidable empire on earth at that particular point. Therefore, many even took immense pride in being part of the British Empire. The British followed a policy which later was referred to as salutary neglect. Salutary neglect means that Britain did not interfere too much in the affairs of the colonies. As long as the primary intentions of Britain were upheld, which is colonies remain loyal, they provide raw materials, and be a market for the products of Britain, Britain was not keen in interfering in nitty-gritties, the day-to-day affairs. So this worked like a symbiotic relationship. This policy of Britain is referred to as salutary neglect, a neglect that is healthy. It is not a negative neglect, it's a healthy sort of a neglect. This salutary neglect meant that these colonies will be given tremendous space for developing their own self-government systems. Britain did not interfere in their internal governance related matters. Each of these 13 colonies had elected assemblies for themselves. Yes, it was not based on universal adult franchise. The franchise was very limited. Nevertheless, they had their elected assemblies and each of them could pass laws for themselves. This enabled the 13 colonies to develop politically independent of each other. There wasn't a single structure above all of these 13 colonies. Each of the colony was politically separate entity and was directly connected with the British Parliament. But to keep control over the colonies and also to protect them, the governors and military commanders were usually appointed by the British Crown itself. Since Britain valued these colonies a lot and did not want to lose them at any cost, it ensured that these colonies remained under the firm grip as such of the British. We'll see that Parliament of Britain will pass several laws in colonial interest, British colonial interest, that apply to these 13 colonies. The Parliament's laws were applicable to these colonies and they had to submit to it. And many of the laws that will be passed by the British Parliament will seem to be irritants by the Americans. For example, Britain passed the Navigation Act in 1651. This Navigation Act said that the Americans had to use only British shipping for their trading purposes. The Enumerated Commodities Act said that some of the commodities, like for example indigo, had to be exported to Britain alone, not to any other European country. Also, there was the Staple Act, which said that European countries sending anything to these 13 colonies had to route them via Britain. So, say a French ship is trading with the American colonies, the ship will first have to go to Britain, unload the stuff, pay custom duty on it, and only then it could go on to America and then sell those wares over there. In this manner, many laws were passed which upheld the British mercantile interest. But the 13 colonies did not mind it so much because Britain did not enforce this strictly. Britain was pretty lenient about this, and therefore the Americans did not really mind these laws being passed. As long as two things were not compromised, Britain was happy to let the colonies have their way. First was British supremacy, and second was Britain's mercantile capitalism. These were the two top priorities of the Britishers, and the Americans ensured that they never crossed this red line. And therefore, this was a couple that was living happily. But this was set to change. वो story ही क्या जिसमें twist ना हो. In this story, the twist comes in the form of the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War is a landmark war fought not just in Europe, it was fought in America as well as it was fought here in India during the Anglo-French Wars, which I have discussed in my Modern India series. In the 7 Years' War, the two major colonial empires, Britain and France, they wanted to decide once and for all their, colonial related friction issues. So this war will be fought on multiple continents in which other European powers will side with one or the other. Some will side with Britain, whereas others will stand with France. In this war, the relationship of Britain and the 13 colonies will alter or change forever. To understand why and how it changes, let us have a quick look at the map of North America before the 7 Years' War. This map on the right side, on my right here, is the map before the war. The pink shaded areas clearly show the British possessions, the 13 colonies. These shaded areas with yellowish orange and pink color, these are the disputed areas which French as well as Britishers claim. And on the other side of the Mississippi River, these yellowish orange areas, they were under the French control. The 7 Years' War was fought to decide the fate of these disputed areas. So what happened in this 7 Years' War? Let us see the outcome of this 7 Years' War. By the way, guys, on a side note, Winston Churchill, who will become the PM of Britain in World War II, he had referred to the 7 Years' War as the First World War. Now, he is a veteran of both the wars. He has seen them up close, and he referred to the 7 Years' War as the First World War. Of course, it's not accepted as such in history, but then that you can understand the significance of that war. Let us see the significance in this relationship, that is Britain and the 13 colonies. What happened in this 7 Years' War? In this 7 Years' War, Britain was able to defeat the French, and the war came to an end with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. As per this treaty, the French influence was ended in Northern and Western America. French were virtually kicked out of all of those places. Now, from the colonies' perspective, the biggest threat that they faced, the biggest security risk that they had was the French, and that was gone. French was gone. The entire area east of Mississippi River was now under British control. And this gave the Americans a sense of security that they don't have any danger that they have to worry about. They don't have to look over their shoulders what the French are actually trying to do, because the French are now defeated and gone. The confidence thus of these white colonists, the Americans, white Americans, was at a very high level. For the first time, these people had participated in a real modern war. And therefore, we can say that they also now had experienced officers at their command. All of this made the colonists confident, one would say, maybe brash also in some views. France and allies who had been defeated in this war were on the lookout for taking vengeance from Britain. And therefore, they wanted to spoil Britain's party and were ready to offer their services to the American people to fight back against their motherland if they so choose. The French wanted to have that solace. Hum to doobenge sanam, tumko bhi le doobenge. That was the whole idea about the French. Britain had won in this war, but at a grave financial cost. There was a huge debt that Britain incurred, and it had to overcome this quickly in the interest of its economy. This shifted the attitude of the Britishers towards the colonies. On my left, guys, you can see the map of America after the 7 Years' War. You can see the entire area is now shaded pink east of the Mississippi River. The French areas are gone. The green areas are under control of Spain. In the exchange that was done, this area west of Mississippi River was now under Spanish control, and the Spaniards were not keen as such to invade the areas of Britain. Consequently, the American colonists are now feeling very safe. This is going to change the attitude of both Britain and the 13 colonies. Let us now trace how this sense of security and the financial exigency before Britain will lead to the divorce between this couple. Let's get started, guys. We are seeing the chain of events leading to the Revolutionary War. The new Prime Minister Grenville faced an uphill task. He had to quickly revive the economy from the doldrums because of the 7 Years' War. And therefore, he gave up the earlier policies and started to raise taxes on the Americans. Britain felt that the war was fought for the sake of the colonies. The French were a threat to the 13 colonies, and consequently, they must also now bear the burden of the expenses of the war. The policy of salutary neglect followed earlier was now given up, and Britain started to interfere. It started to irritate the Americans with newer and newer set of laws. The first in this came in the form of Crown's Proclamation of 1763. The Crown's Proclamation of 1763 said that the white settler Americans, the colonists that is, will not cross the Appalachian Mountains. Britain now had the area east of Mississippi River till the coast. The white settler Americans wanted to expand towards the west. But Britain says, no, you cannot expand to the west because there are Native American tribes living over there. The Red Indians, as they were called. These Red Indians, or at least many of these tribes, had helped out Britain in the 7 Years' War. They were allies. Furthermore, they were warriors, and extension into their areas would necessarily lead to wars with them, and this Britain did not want at any cost after the 7 Years' War. Americans felt bitterly disappointed at this because they had for long cherished that dream, a greedy one though, of expanding into these areas. So they now feel disappointed that the whole war, from their perspective, was now purposeless. The 7 Years' War, for which they had fought and sacrificed, had not served their purpose. If this was not enough, Britain passed a series of acts which became extremely unpopular amongst the Americans. This included acts like the Currency Act, which had demonetized several currencies which had become, whose value had been lost. The British traders used to buy and sell with American people, and American people used to pay them in old American currency which had become devalued. This led to losses for British merchants, and consequently, these old currencies were demonetized, leading to a lot of hardship for the Americans. After the Currency Act came the Sugar Act. Sugar had to be exported to America only, and this again led to conflicts between the colonists and Britain. But perhaps the most unpopular one was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act brought about a new tax on several goods that were manufactured in America. It did not even leave documents and newspapers. Almost everything had to pay a tax to the British government. Only when the tax was paid were these goods stamped, and therefore the name Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was followed up by Quartering Act. British government said that in those areas where there are no garrisons, there are no quarters for the British troops, the Americans will have to, accommodate them, bear for their expenses. The Americans hated this Quartering Act. They felt that this act was brought about to humiliate them. Now that the French danger was gone, there was no need for British troops in America in the first place. These troops, they felt, were being kept to dominate the Americans themselves. And moreover, they are being made to pay and accommodate them. This was naturally a double whammy for the Americans. If this was not enough, later on, many such other measures will be taken. But the Americans will not take it lying low. The Americans decided to take some active steps to build up political opinion against these acts. Since the 13 colonies had been virtually independent of each other, politically speaking, there was no single body to raise their voice. So first committee of correspondence was created by Samuel Adams to bring Americans across the 13 colonies on the same page, to make them understand that we need to put up a united resistance before the Britishers. The Stamp Act Congress was specifically convened to raise the demand that the Britishers could not tax the Americans. As per a principle that was accepted by Britain itself, there couldn't be taxation on the Americans because the British Parliament did not have representation from the American people. So how could British Parliament have the authority to tax them? This was, characterized by a very famous slogan or a cry that you all have read in your school days: no taxation without a representation. Britishers finally climbed down after the demands by Americans started to become more and more militant. Organizations such as the Sons of Liberty came up to campaign against the tax and other measures that the Britishers were bringing up. Britishers mollified the Americans by taking back some of the measures, but also passed the Declaratory Act in 1765. This Declaratory Act said that although some of these measures are being taken back, it does not mean that British Parliament does not have the right to impose such measures. They unequivocally said that Britain can very well take any such measure in future. So the conflict was not over, it had only been postponed. And it will resurface with more viciousness. So what happens after this? Let us now see. Townshend Act, named after the British, in charge of the Exchequer, Townshend. This act imposed taxes on many new items that Americans were producing. This included the common beverage of tea also. Americans were now aghast. They felt that now water is, reaching a level which they cannot bear, and they really need to protest against this. The Boston Massacre took place in this very same context. Militant American leaders came out on the streets and protested against the Townshend Act. British troops posted in the port city of Boston, they fired into American protesters. Several of them lay dead in a pool of blood. And this became sort of, if I may give an analogy, like their Jallianwala Bagh movement. It exposed or made naked the British imperialism. The idea that Britishers here are interested only in their revenue needs became clear to a lot of Americans who were yet fence sitters. Boston Massacre would reverberate across the 13 colonies. Furthermore, the Tea Act was passed in 1772. This Tea Act came in the context of the financial crisis of East India Company. East India Company, which had a monopoly of trading east of Cape of Good Hope, had established political power in India. It had defeated big armies. From a trader, it had been transformed into a political power, but financially, it was standing on the precipice of bankruptcy. It asked for a huge loan from Bank of England and told the government that it cannot pay the annuities which it was due to pay. To bring out East India Company from this abyss, a Tea Act was passed in Britain. This Tea Act gave the monopoly of tea trade to East India Company. Across the British Empire, on which they used to say the sun never sets, across that colonial empire of Britain, tea would be traded only by one entity, that is the East India Company. And therefore, this led to a lot of anger in Americans. Samuel Adams, the founder of Sons of Liberty, a very radical leader of the American Revolution, he and his group, dressed up as Native Americans, entered into the port of Boston, went on board a EIC ship which was carrying caskets of tea and flung them into the Atlantic Ocean. A huge amount of tea was thrown into the ocean, and this event came to be called as the Boston Tea Party. It was a very colorful way of protesting against the Britishers, which could not go unnoticed. The fact that they had dressed themselves up as Native Americans made a strong political statement. The writings were clear on the wall. British people, their politicians, the press could see that Americans were saying that they don't identify themselves anymore with Britain. They were more connected now with the American soil. And it was natural. These American freedom fighters, they were third, fourth generation people who had been brought up there in the colonies. Consequently, that connect or cord with Britain had over the years become more and more weak. This the British government, parliament, the British political opinion did not like. And there was a huge demand, an outcry to make the American people pay for this act of theirs. The British Parliament passed a series of acts which was called as coercive acts, collectively called as coercive acts. Americans called it intolerable acts. These acts were designed in a manner to punish the Americans for what they had done. The vengeance, the wrath of British Parliament fell the most on the port of Boston. Boston, remember, was the most important port of the American colonies. For 6 months, this port, which was the lifeline of American trade, so to speak, the port of Boston was blockaded for 6 months by the Britishers. Americans felt that they now need to come together and devise a uniform action for all the 13 colonies. For this purpose, the first Continental Congress was called for in the city of Philadelphia in 1774. Representatives of 12 out of the 13 colonies, they met, Georgia being the exception. They met and they decided on a response to the British challenge. They put forth a set of demands, what they expected from Britain. They tried to assure Britain that they want a good relationship with it, but provided certain basic terms and conditions are met. Primary amongst these were demands about industry. American people wanted to develop their own industry, which Britain was prohibiting. Why? Because Britain obviously wanted to trade in finished goods and did not want Americans to develop their industry as such. Second, the ability or freedom to trade with other countries without British interference. Why should European goods first go to Britain, pay custom duties, and then come to America? Why should Americans trade only on British ships? There were many such grievances that Americans wanted to be redressed. These grievances were the core of British mercantilism. That is what it was based on. So naturally, Britain wasn't going to be happy about these demands. And lastly, and most significantly, they said no taxation without representation. These set of demands were presented to the British government, and they did not take them very kindly. British ruler King George III said, now the die has been cast. The colonies must either fight or submit. It was the proverbial crossing of the Rubicon. Britain was now ready for a war with these 13 colonies. Were the colonies ready for this? They would soon be. The colonies called the Second Continental Congress in 1776, and once again in the city of Philadelphia, all of these colonies met. This time, all 13, full house, and they adopted the Declaration of Independence. After a lot of debate, pulling, hauling, convincing, arguing, finally, the 13 colonies decided that we will have to fight it out. We will chart our own independence. Benjamin Franklin had played a very crucial role in this. He very vociferously had been arguing, not recently, but for many years, for independence from Britain. And that is why, guys, Benjamin Franklin is often called as the first American. A very noteworthy role was also played by Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine wrote a famous essay by the title Common Sense. In this essay, Common Sense, Thomas Paine argued that it was illogical for a small country on the other side of the Atlantic to rule over such massive colonies. If freed from the control of Britain, these colonies could flourish and develop into something very, very mammoth. And his logic, the simple and articulate way in which he expressed and wrote this essay, convinced a lot of Americans who had till then been fence sitters, who had not been able to decide whether Americans should seek a divorce from Britain. Finally, with public opinion on their side and also the top leaders convinced, Americans will embark on their war of independence. This war of independence will start with the Second Continental Congress selecting George Washington as the commander of the American troops. George Washington, a young officer, a veteran of the 7 Years' War, was a rich planter from the state of Virginia. He was a man of great integrity, courage, and also a person who was very fanatically devoted to the cause of his people's independence. George Washington will lead the militia of the Americans. I mean, there were soldiers also, but given the constraints on resources, these soldiers were not very well paid. They did not have the best of weaponry to fight against an army which was considered as the best army in the world. But luckily, they did have some support from rivals of Britain. France and Spain, who had earlier been defeated in the 7 Years' War, were ready to help the Americans with resources. Throughout the course of the war, the Americans faced many losses, many reverses in several battles, but George Washington held on tenaciously. The situation had become so dire that the Congress could not even pay for the salaries of the officers and soldiers in the army. But they were ultimately fighting for their motherland. It wasn't just for, prestige and pay that they were fighting for. Their tenacity, resourcefulness, their resilience finally paid off. And at the Battle of Yorktown, British commander Lord Cornwallis will finally surrender before the Americans. After this, some desultory fighting did go on for some time, but for all practical purposes, the war as such was over. France brokered a treaty between the two. In Paris, both the sides met, and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. And with this treaty, America got its independence. This is the story of American Revolution, guys. Let us now understand what will be the significance of this revolution. Post the revolution, the Americans met in 1787, once again in the same place at the Constitutional Convention, and they drafted for America a new constitution. The 13 colonies had come together to chart a political future for themselves. They all created a unique and new model for governing this modern nation state that was born. Famously, it was said that 13 clocks struck together and USA will start its journey into this new world. Now let us understand the significance of this revolution. Why is American Revolution such an important one in the history of the world? Number one, it was the first successful rebellion by a colony against its metropole. It naturally gave a lot of heart to other colonies over the next few years, decades, and centuries to fight for their rights. It is not a coincidence that our political body or organization that led the freedom struggle was named as Indian National Congress. The word Congress is inspired from the Philadelphia Congress, which was at the center stage of this revolution. Many other colonies will follow suit and gain independence in due course of time. This revolution gave birth to a powerful nation that influenced the history of the world, especially in the 20th and 21st century as we speak. From World War I onwards, we will see that USA, by now a powerful industrial player, will play a crucial role in international politics. Especially after World War II, when there was a bipolar world, USA had played a crucial role as one of these two poles. After the death of USSR, we know, after the disintegration of USSR, we know that we live in a unipolar world and USA continues to be that one pole, although China is certainly closing in very fast. This revolution gave birth to that powerful nation. It enshrined the idea of republicanism, the idea that there have to be no privileges based on birth. That is the core of republicanism. Elected head of the state is a consequence of that. All over the world, when there were monarchical systems, when Europe in fact was at the peak of absolute monarchies, the Americans challenged this idea. The idea of divine rights monarchy, Shivagamini style Mera Vachan Hi Hai Shasan, that kind of monarchy will not be accepted anymore. That was the voice coming out of the American Revolution. If monarchy was not accepted, then automatically other privileges that were associated with that structure, those were also effectively challenged. Separation of powers. America developed a constitutional scheme in which executive, legislature, judiciary, all of these, their powers were segregated and they had a check and balance based system. Each one trying to ensure that the other does not become dictatorial. Otherwise, we would have monarchy in some other name. What is the point of that? So a unique checks and balances based system evolved in America. And all of this was being done to ensure that the individual's rights were upheld. The state is very powerful, the almighty. The individual is very weak. That individual has to be given safeguard and protection because the state can trample upon the rights of that individual. And for that reason, the individual is given the armor of fundamental rights. In the Bill of Rights, the American Constitution enshrines certain specific rights that every citizen will enjoy. It will never be taken away from him. Speech, press, religion, justice, all of these things became essential for the fullest development of the individual's personality. We in our constitution also, as you know, have taken this idea basically from the American Constitution. Given the nature of the 13 colonies and their earlier history of political autonomy, they decided upon a structure that was federal in nature. Federalism became a go-to idea or concept for countries which had different regions with different requirements. We too have developed a structure which is quasi-federal. Not exactly like USA, but certainly it does enshrine a lot of latitude for the states for their own unique specific requirements. Then the idea of presidential form of democracy. To balance that federal structure and yet not allow secession and separatism to breed, a presidential form of democracy where the president is directly elected by the people was developed in America. So a unique model where federal polity is balanced by presidential form of democracy and vice versa, that brewed in America. Anti-colonialism got a big boost as America supported the idea throughout the course of its independent history. After World War II, we will see many countries will gain freedom and the third world will be born. America had a crucial role to play in this. The folding back of Europe, the going back of the European empires, America had been a catalyst in that context. The French Revolution and many other developments of Europe. In 1789, the people of France will rise with the same set of ideas: nationalism, liberty, equality, fraternity, secularism, so on and so forth. And they will then be emulated by many others in Europe. All of this, in many ways, can be traced back to the American Revolution. Definitely, the Americans inspired the French. 10,000 French soldiers had fought in the American Revolution. It was obvious that the ideas of the American Revolution will find their way to France as well. Thus was born USA, which became a melting pot of races. Huge in terms of its size, it required people, human population, and therefore it attracted and wanted people to come from all over the world. And we'll see that many different races will go to USA to create a dream future for themselves. And it continues to be the case even today. USA became a melting pot of races. Having said all of this, it isn't that it was all, hunky-dory and positive. All of these rights and freedoms and liberty and equality, it did not reach everybody automatically. The blacks will have to fight it out for another century almost before slavery is abolished. Although rights will be enshrined, but practically that same level of dignity will not be given. And Martin Luther King will have to give that famous speech, "I have a dream," in 1960s in the civil rights movement. Women too were not given the same rights as men. It would take a long struggle for them also to get that same level of treatment and equality. But in the total summation of things, one can surely say that USA, its birth, its subsequent history has been a very significant development for the world. I hope you enjoyed this particular session. If you watched till here, I'm sure you found a lot of value in it. Then do leave some love in the comment box below. Like this video and share it with your friends. I'll see you in some other lecture with similar seminal developments from the history of the world. Thank you very much.